summer morning in 1650. A family is leaving a town in Western Europe to begin a new life in a new world. During the late 16th and throughout the 70s, large numbers of people left Europe to settle in lands they had never seen. Many came from Holland and from England. Some left their native farms, where changing methods required fewer workers. Some left towns that were becoming overpopulated. They risked their lives in long voyages across dangerous seas. What impelled them to settle in strange, unknown lands? To understand this movement from the Old World, let's look at some of the conditions in Europe that led to colonial expansion. One of the first countries to establish an overseas empire was little Portugal, with lands in South America, in Africa, and in India. Even more spectacular was the rise of Spain. By 1575, Spain held lands in North America, South America, Northern Africa, and the Philippines, a rich empire that made Spain the greatest power in Europe. Products from these empires, in a steady stream of ships, brought to Spain and Portugal new wealth, cash received by selling the goods from overseas. The new wealth profoundly changed European economy. To get a cash surplus, a nation might barter its cheap manufactured goods for far more valuable products, such as furs. These could then be sold in Europe at great profit. Or a nation might take precious ores, such as silver or other raw materials from the New World, and by manufacture or processing, turn them into valuable products that would bring cash on Europe's markets. This was part of the new mercantile theory. In order to be powerful, a nation sought to gain a great cash surplus. It might trade cheap goods for more valuable wares, or it might turn raw materials into manufactured goods to sell for cash. Some cash surplus would buy more cheap goods or raw materials. Some cash surplus went to raise the standard of living. Some of the surplus was used to raise military forces on a national scale. Spain had an early start in building a huge army, which could be moved in the troop ships of the great Spanish Navy. Spanish galleons brought the lifeblood of gold from Spain's overseas empire. And it was on the sea that Spain suffered serious losses of power. In the latter 16th century, Dutch naval victories helped the Netherlands achieve independence from Spain. And in 1588, an English fleet won a crowning triumph by defeating the great Spanish Armada. The loss of the Armada was the start of Spain's decline as a naval power, with far-reaching results in Europe. The balance of power was shifting from Spain to the rising national states of England, Holland, and France. At the same time, the economy of Europe was changing too. No longer was the emphasis on self-sufficient farming, with each community producing for its own needs. The emphasis was on manufacturing in quantity for export, making items such as glassware to sell for profit. This was the mercantile theory in practice. Under the impetus of trade, living standards in Europe began to rise. This interior of a Dutch house shows us the fine glassware, clothing, and other furnishings enjoyed by the rising middle class. This famous painting of a Dutch woman weighing gold reminds us that gold was one form of the cash surplus so important in the new mercantilism. The woman's pearls may have come from the East Indies. The fur may have come from distant Russia. Here are evidences of far-flung commerce and wealth. Among the first to benefit from the new mercantilism were the Dutch. Since their small, low country was not rich in natural resources, the Dutch had for centuries turned to the sea for income from fishing and coastal commerce. By the 16th century, Holland was depending more and more on her trading houses for existence. And now, in the 17th century, Amsterdam was one of the busiest harbors in the world. On the Amsterdam Exchange, similar to a modern stock exchange, shares of corporations were bought and sold. Amsterdam was the financial center of Europe. Not only Holland, but England and France also had seaport cities that were growing in importance. All three countries had been active in overseas explorations, and now, in the age of colonial expansion, there was more and more activity on the seas. But ships and trade routes were not enough. To hold the new overseas markets, each country must have her own people. There must be colonists and colonies. This Dutch merchant and his wife, looking over the harbor of Batavia in the East Indies, represent some of the people who built the colonial empires. To hold these lands, each nation sought to plant colonies. New Amsterdam in North America was one of the permanent Dutch settlements. Holland had holdings that stretched from the Hudson River to Java. England had important interests in North America and in India. France, too, had claims in these lands. Who would pay for establishing colonies in these lands? Who would foot the bills for the weapons, the implements, the supplies that the colonists would need? No one ruler could afford to. But in the 17th century, merchants and wealthy noblemen formed companies, syndicates, and petitioned their sovereigns for land grants and trade monopolies. These Dutch gentlemen, painted by Rembrandt, are typical of the rising bourgeois or middle-class businessmen who are the driving forces of colonial expansion. The national governments granted charters to the companies, giving them the right to establish trading posts and forts. This royal charter is a grant from King Charles II to the English East India Company. In printed books, more people were reading and learning about the new lands, the native peoples, the valuable products. Now came the period of recruiting adventuresome men and women, those who would build the trading posts and settle the new lands. Some would go to the unsettled vastness of America. Some would go to compete with the older civilizations of India. Some would go to the distant tropical islands of the East Indies. And who would go? Which people would have reason to leave the old world? Dispossessed farmers moved to the cities, and if they failed to find work there, as often happened, they were candidates for colonization. Between wars, discharged soldiers welcomed a chance at the adventure and possible gain that colonization offered. Frequent depressions in the changing, unsettled economy brought much poverty. The poor would go. The rich would go too. Often the younger sons of noble families sought new fortunes in the new lands. And then there were many ordinary people who left simply because they could not be absorbed into agriculture or industry. The population of Europe was increasing rapidly. The excess began to migrate. Some left for still another reason: religious freedom. From historic Delftshaven in Holland, the Pilgrims, religious refugees, sailed for the New World. The Pilgrims and other Puritans, Quakers and Catholics in England, as well as Calvinists in France, were some of the groups that left, not for trade or adventure, but to find a place in America where they could live and worship in their own way. Still other religious colonists were Catholic priests, men such as the Jesuits, who were eager to convert and educate natives in Canada and other lands. And so, from many different places in Western Europe, and for many different reasons, people joined in the great movement of colonial expansion. By 1700, Europe's overseas empires were well begun. Spain and Portugal had built empires including immense holdings in the Americas. England had holdings largely in North America and India. France, too, had claims ranging from North America to India, and Holland's smaller empire included lands in South America, Africa, and the East Indies. In some places, as in India, the Europeans obtained by force entire cities and kingdoms to exploit commercially. In other places, as in North America, forts were built in the untamed wilderness. Some of these were lasting settlements where Europeans laid the foundations for future cities and nations. Such colonies were planted in North America by the French and English. From these French settlements grew some of the permanent cities of North America. Holland founded New Amsterdam. Most successful were the English, whose colonies along the eastern coast became the basis of 13 new states and a new nation. That new nation, the United States, was one of the most important results that stemmed from the age of colonial expansion. That age saw the rise of England, France, and Holland as the builders of overseas empires. Their expansion began with England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Underlying overseas expansion was the mercantile theory. The flow of raw materials and the growth of manufacturing meant rising standards of living for the growing middle class. To maintain the overseas colonies, people were needed, and in increasing numbers, people left their homes. People who made possible the colonial expansion of European nations. It is a summer morning in 1650. A family is leaving a small town in Western Europe to begin a new life in the new world.